Hi, in the next series of videos we're going to look at some of Excel's built-in functions that I think might be most useful to you. This is by no means an exhaustive exploration of the functions available in Excel, but just a place to get you started. Okay, in this first video we're going to look at functions that come under the category of text functions, or how to manipulate text you may have either entered or obtained from another source like a form. So the first thing I want to do with my text here is let's pretend that I did get this from a form and that there are a couple of errors in it. And the error I'm going to introduce in a couple of places here is actually that somebody put a leading space in there. So if someone accidentally hit the space bar as they were typing, you would capture that information through an online form. Now let's look at the most common. Let me insert a header here and just say that the information we have is first name and last name. And now what I really want is a full name. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to get these two together in a single field, perhaps with a space between it. And the function that you would use for that is something called concatenate. All functions start with an equal sign, or all formulas. And as I start to type, you can see that I get two options: concat, and this concatenates a list or a range of strings, and concatenate, which has a yellow exclamation mark on it. And basically that's just telling you that it's a deprecated function, that it still works, but that this would be the newer form. Okay, so for concatenate, which is now concat, I can simply put in the cell number with a comma and the second cell, and it will put them together. Now in truth there's an easier way to do this. As a matter of fact, let me get rid of the function right there and say if I were to click on the first cell, use an ampersand, and then the second, it would do exactly the same thing. Now the only problem is I don't have my space in here, so what I'm going to do is after the first ampersand, I'm going to put a quote, a space, a close quote, and another ampersand. So by spreading this out, you can see what I'm really doing is I'm saying take what's in A2 and add to it a space and add to it what's in B2. And now when I hit enter, I get the value that I want. And of course, copying those down will cause all the cells to get their version of the same formula incremented for the row. Now my problem here is that I've picked up these extra spaces, the one before Roger, a double space here before Blue, and perhaps I should have addressed that before concatenating them. So let's look now how I would address it. I'm going to make another column here, and I'm going to say equals trim. And what trim will do is it will take all the spaces from a text string except for single spaces between words. So in other words, a leading space or a space at the end would be removed, as well as double spaces or triple or whatever. So I'm going to say trim Roger. And then I'll just copy this over here because although I don't have an extra space in Dodger, I'm not going to know that when my data comes in. And I can copy these down. Note that while it did remove the leading space before Blue and before Roger, it did not touch the single space in between this person's last name. So I'm going to copy those, and then I will paste the values right back into the initial space. So I've corrected what's here instead of making two additional columns, although making two additional columns would also be an option, and then using these columns in my formula. Instead, I've chosen just to replace and clean up the data. That means that this is no longer necessary, because I pasted the values back here. So that's concatenate. and trim. But let's say that I'm trying to now build a username out of these names. So these are all people from my district, and I follow the same pattern for their usernames. And the first thing I do is, in a username, I don't include any special characters. So I just eliminate the apostrophes and the hyphens. And here's a case where I don't want to actually change them because this is their last name, but I want an additional column that reflects a version of this last name where the hyphen doesn't exist. Now there is a replace function to do this, but I find there's a simpler way. I'm simply going to copy these and drop them into their own column. I'm going to hold down the Control key and hit H, and that's going to bring a find and replace screen. Now the thing that I want to find is the apostrophe, and I want to replace it with nothing. I just want to strip it out of there, so I'm going to leave the bottom one blank. You'll see it finds it, and when I say replace, it replaces it. Now I could say replace all, but then I would lose control over what was happening here. So the first couple of times I might want to look at it. I also see that I have a hyphen, so I can find the next one of those and replace that. And there's also this space, which I'm not going to leave in a username, although it's perfectly appropriate in a last name to have a space. In a username there's not. So in this case I'm going to put a space and then replace it with nothing. And there it finds it and replace it. So I've stripped out my special characters and spaces using it that way. Now if you were going to do it as an actual replace, we'll take a look at the formula. So that's equal replace. I double click it, you'll see it wants the old text, which is easy enough. I could go to last name here and select it. But then it wants a start number. So it wants to know at what point, how far into this string should I start replacing. Then how many characters to replace. In this case it would be 1. I only would want to get rid of the 1 apostrophe. And then the new text to go in there, which would be a blank. So finding where that apostrophe exists and putting that number in here is very possible, but it's quite a bit more complicated than doing what I just did. So I would recommend maybe not using the replace function for something like this, and just going and doing a find and replace, cleaning up your data. Okay, let's start to build a username. So I'm going to say equals this and this, and now I want to add some text to my username. So I'm going to say, in quotes, at, let's call it mymail.net. Okay, so you can see that starts to build an email address. But there's a couple of things that I'd like to do with this. First of all, I really only want the first initial and the last name. Now the A2 is the first name, so how am I going to get that to be an initial? And the way that I do that is I simply would like the first initial, so I'm going to take from the left, so I type the word left. A2 winds up in parentheses. And then I have to put a comma after the 2. After the 2 in A2 and tell it how many characters I want. And what I want is 1 character. So now you can see that it's just R Dodger. So the left A2 comma 1 gets me 1 character. Now if I'd wanted the first 4 characters, I could have done that. RODG. But in this case it's only 1. Now by the way, the right function, so we've just used the left function, but the right function works exactly the same way. You just put in the number of characters you want to the right. Sometimes it's a calculated value. The other thing I like to do is I like all my usernames to be lowercase. So in order to do that, I can take the entire thing that I've already put together, put it in parentheses, and simply add the word lower in front of it. And that will strip out all the capitals. So if I wanted a lower version of this, I could just say lower parenthesis D2 close parenthesis. But what I'm doing is I'm taking a lowercase version of the entire thing. Now you can see that I've made a mistake because the apostrophe, the dash, and the space still exist here. And that's because when I referenced this, I used cells A, from column A, which is fine, and B. And I really should have used this cleaned up version over here in D. So that's easy enough to change. Instead of B, we'll simply say D. And now when I copy it down, those extra characters that I don't want are gone. Now these addresses, of course, are still formulas. So if I'm happy with them, I can copy them, copy them, and paste them back in the same space as values. Now they're no longer values. Now let's suppose for a second that this was not something I constructed. These were emails I'd collected. So they're not all the same. One of them's a Hotmail. One of those is at yahoo.com. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to find the different domains that I'm dealing with. So I'd like to find the at and everything at the end. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to find the length of each one of these things. So that's len, the length of this. And that particular address is 18 characters, and you can see that they vary. And now I'm going to use a command called find. It's a great text command. And what text do I want to find? I want to find the at sign, so I'm going to put that in quotes. And then it's asking me, the second argument is within text, and this is the text I want to find it in. So now it's telling me that while the length of this is 18, the at sign is in the 8th position. And let me readjust the widths of a couple of these things so we have a little more room to work. Okay, and let me take my notes here and move them over a little bit. Great. Okay, so we've looked at find and we've looked at length. And how can I use these two values to get my domains? I can simply say equals. Well, I want the right side now. So I'd like the right portion of this. Now, how much do I want? Well, I want the entire length minus the first part up to the at sign. But I want to include the at sign. So I'm going to say I would like the right, well, let's just say it's the right 8 characters. Well, that's not going to work because identifying where the at sign is, that's working from the left. So instead, what I want to do is I want to take the length minus that. And that's almost perfect. Okay, now you can see if I do that, I'm going to get everything after the at sign, which is almost what I'm looking for. I would like one additional character from the right side, and so I can simply just say, give me one more character. And there it is. Okay, so I've taken the total length, identified where the at sign is, taken everything to the right of that, plus one additional character from the right, which is the at sign. And two other functions I'm not going to explore right now are exact and mid. And these are just two additional text-based functions that are worth looking at, useful in some circumstance. But hopefully the ones I've given you are the most common and useful.